Well, today's the day we've been shooting for a long time and thinking about for quite a while. And so I wanted to just kind of give it its due context. We're not a church that hypes a lot of stuff or tries to oversell or overpromises things, but I really do believe that today, as we kick off this series we're calling Putting Down Roots, that it is a significant moment in our church. We're saying it's a movement in our community and for our community. And we've chosen those words very carefully because we want to convey more properly what it is that we're trying to do. This is, I believe, over these next several weeks, one of the most important periods of Wellspring's history. And again, I don't say that lightly, I don't say that often. I think this opportunity that we have to do some stuff together is going to be really significant and important as we go through it together. We're calling it a series, but it's much more than that. It really is a movement that we're trying to do. And we're going to talk about a building and how we put a building onto a property and all that stuff, but it's a lot more than a building. We really are trying to create a movement in this city. And so I want to say to you just a couple of things, a couple of challenges as we head into this morning. First of all, I want to challenge you to be with us these next Sundays, these next 5 weeks. If this is your first week or if you come all the time, I just want to challenge you to be with us as we kind of walk through these next several weeks together, 6 total, counting today. So you can just check that off the list. You already got 1 done, you just got 5 more. If you want to be here with us for these next 6 weeks, I think that would really be helpful. I also want to challenge you to pray every day for this movement that we're trying to create in Spring Hill. And I really do mean that. I think God notices these sorts of things. So I want to challenge you, if you want to put a note on your refrigerator, on your alarm clock, however you want to do that, but just be reminded to pray. If you commute, maybe put something on your steering wheel and just remind you just to pray for what God's doing here with us. And then the other thing I want to challenge you to do is I want to challenge every one of us, 100% if we can pull it off, to attend one of the 4, we're calling them PAVE events. If you got a bulletin, you can look in there. There's dates in there and descriptions of what the PAVE is, but it stands for Prayer and Vision Evenings. It's here on this page. There's 4 different dates we're doing them. They're identical dates, so you don't need to go to all of them. You don't need to go to more than one. We're just doing multiples, because we're short on space out at the farmhouse. And so if you can sign up, letting us know that you're coming, letting us know that if you have children, that they'll be here. We'll make sure we have enough space for everybody. But also we did 4 because we want everyone to be able to come to one. And everybody's schedule's busy. So if you're going to look at these 4 dates, probably 2 of them immediately you can't make them for whatever reason. You've got something scheduled. So if you want to plan to make one of these 4, that would be really great. There's a table there in the back that has sign-ups, place to sign up your kids and also adults. If you can let us know you're coming, that would really be great. The point of these evenings is really important because we're going to, in these evenings, try to do 2 things. First of all, we're going to try to help you understand a little better the vision of what we're doing. So we're going to talk some about some specifics of the vision, but also give you a chance for question and answer. That's going to be probably the best part of the night is for you to say, okay, I'm wondering about this, or how's this working, or how are you guys thinking about that, or whatever. There's no, by the way, just make sure we're very clear, no talk of dollars or anything from you. We're not asking anything from you that night. We want to help you out to understand the vision. But then secondly, we want you we want us to pray together that God would use this movement that we're trying to build and create and ride together to meet the things He needs done in this city. So I want to challenge you to come to one of those 4 events. After service, if you want to go to the back, this will be there the next couple of weeks. Sign up, and that would help us out tremendously. I'm using the word movement a lot, and I'm using it on purpose. We talked about what should we call this thing, and it's more than a series. We talked about calling it a campaign, but that's so loaded with context from what other churches do that that's not exactly what we're trying to do. We can say something about a building, but it's so much bigger than a building. So we settled on the word movement because we feel like that really is what we're trying to do. And so I wanted to talk for just a second about movements and what a movement is and kind of distinguish those things from something else. First of all, a true movement is about a larger mission. This is not about a particular project or a particular vision or a particular building. It's bigger than that. What we're talking about is creating a movement in Spring Hill that follows the vision and mission that God has given us all along. Several years ago, it sort of bubbled up to the top. We didn't start off with some slick statement, but as we kind of went, it kind of bubbled up that what we were trying to do is to help people follow Jesus. And so we put that on all the posters and websites and all that kind of stuff. And this building, then, is about helping people follow Jesus. It's not about housing our services. This building houses our services. It's bigger than that. It's about a movement. And true movements are about a larger mission. True movements are also like riding waves. Sometimes you get people get people excited about certain things, or get people ginned up on something, and creative people put together pictures and videos and such, and that can get people excited. But what we're talking about is different than that. It's more like riding a wave. If you go surfing, nobody in first hour has ever surfed. Anybody ever surf here in this? All right, that's good. All the coastal people come to second hour. That's great. I'll write that down. That's good. But if you've ever surfed, you don't create the wave. We can't do that. You don't work with the tides and things. You just hop on what's already being built. And we really do believe this is God's hand leading us to these things. We put lots of hours in prayer already and want to do lots more hours in prayer. And we really do believe that we're not just trying to push this through on God's watch, but that we're actually just hopping on to what God already has in mind for us to do. True movements are like that. And true movements are also not self-serving. Lots of the things people motivate people to do often have a self-serving motive in mind. But what we're talking about is not self-serving at all. What we're talking about is, well, how can we use this facility and this property to not serve ourselves, but to serve Spring Hill? How can we do it to serve our neighbors and serve our friends and those who are not yet connected to us in any way? You know, I know a lot of different guys who've started churches. And I will talk to them on occasion over these last couple of years as we knew kind of maybe this is where we're going eventually. And so I'd find a guy who maybe is in a portable situation, a movie theater or a school like we are, and they've moved into a building of their own. I'll ask them, what was that like? What went well? What didn't go well? What would you do differently? Those kind of questions. And they often talk about the excitement of lots of people will come and check out your church, and many of them are not Christians, or maybe in a school or theater for whatever reason they just won't, but they will in those settings. And so you help a lot of people come find their way back to God and reach faith and things. That's exciting. And they talk about ways you can serve the community because you're there 7 days a week, and that's exciting. And there's all kinds of opportunities they talk about. But almost consistently, the one negative people talk about is they say at the end of it, after a year of working on it, a year and a half or whatever we spent getting ready for this thing, when we finally get in the building, it's like we change a little bit. We become a little more self-centered, a little more selfish, to be honest. We're a little more focused on our own needs and our own thoughts and such. And I've heard it consistently enough that it's something to be aware of. And we've had people say, be teaching into that because that's something that's going to happen. But it hit me just recently, and I don't know, maybe you can help me with this. I think most churches, when they go from being portable, and that's hard and difficult, and they want to move into a building, the point of that is this is going to be easier. No more set up and tear down, no more dirty classrooms, no more whatever. And so that's their motive. And so they spend a year and a half saying, how can we build this building to suit us best? And they have teams and committees and things that they vote on. How would this fit our needs best, or this serve our needs best, or this help us the best? How can we make this the best for us? And they spend a year and a half spending lots of money, lots of energy, lots of time, lots of effort, lots of focus on how can we make this tool be the best for us, what we want. And they come out at the end of it having focused on themselves for a year and a half, and now they're fighting about the color of the carpet, and they're fighting about this wall should be here versus there, and it's all very self-centered and focused, and then they launch this new building, and it's all about them. Well, it sort of makes sense, really. So what we're trying to do is not be about self-centered at all. And as much excitement as I have on some of the aspects of not being in a portable facility, that's not at all what we're doing. We're building this building so we can serve the community better. We're building this building to help people come back to God and find faith in God. We're not just building this building to house our services or to serve ourselves. And so at the end of this, Lord willing, we won't be focused on ourselves. We won't be self-centered. We won't be fighting over things like carpet and wall colors. That won't be where we're at. We'll be spending more of our time about what really matters. It's a movement that we're trying to create, and that's very different than a campaign or a sermon series or even building a building. If you get your Bible, I want you to turn with me to Acts chapter 2. The first sign of a church having a movement in our world was here in the book of Acts chapter 2, and I want us to spend a few moments there this morning. This is a verse we often go to because it's a model for us a bit, but I think there's some great things for us to pull out of it this morning. If you're not familiar with the Bible, first of all, feel free to grab one of those. But if you're not familiar with the Bible, the book of Acts is a history of the church as it started from the time that Jesus left this earth all the way through to all these new churches were started and the leaders led and all those things. And it serves as a model for us to follow after. So Acts chapter 2, page 759 in these Bibles here. I want us to look at verse 42 and following all the way to the end of the chapter. Acts chapter 2, verse 42. It says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and miraculous signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. And every day they continued to meet together in their homes, in the temple courts, and they broke bread in their homes, and they ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. Now this is truly a movement of God. I mean, every day one other family was coming back to God. Another individual was giving their life over to Jesus. Someone who didn't believe in God was now a follower of Jesus. Someone who had been Jewish and opposed the works of Jesus was now fighting for the works of Jesus. Another family who was a mess is now getting their life turned around every day. And it delays out, if you read through the book of Acts, moments when thousands of people would come to faith in addition to the everyday kind of things that were happening. Every day they were meeting together. Every day they were studying together. Every day they were loving each other and spending time together. Historians say that this city of 200,000, Jerusalem, over the first 25 years or so of Christianity, went from no Christians, unless you count Jesus, I guess he was one Christian, all the way to half the city, about 100,000 people, had given themselves over to Christ in about 25 years. From 1 to 100,000 in 25 years, now that's a movement. And rarely have we seen that kind of movement happen in our world ever since. This is one of the only examples we see of it. But there's some things I want to debunk a minute, because I think sometimes we think things are required to do this that are not required. Things that we think are essential that are not even in Scripture. Sometimes you hear people say, well, you need lots of people. You need to get a church with thousands of people together, and they can then create some sort of movement and dent in the city. But that's not true. If you have your Bible there in Acts, look over at chapter 1, verse 15. This was just days before the verse we just read. And chapter 1, verse 15, page 758, says, in those days, Peter stood up among the believers, among the church, a group numbering about 120. So from 120 people, in a matter of days and months and years, a whole movement starts in Jerusalem. There are more people worshiping together in this building today than were worshiping God that day, waiting for God to create a movement. And we serve the same God, we have the same Savior, we have the same Holy Spirit that God has offered to us that He's offered to them. And the same movement He started amongst that small group, He could start amongst us today. There's just some really important things we've got to make sure we have. But thousands of people is not one of them. Sometimes you think, well, it needs a charismatic leader or a brilliant leadership team or those sort of things. That's what you have to do that. That's not what they had. Look at chapter 4, verse 13, one page over. Acts chapter 4, verse 13, page 760, it says, when the leaders saw the courage of Peter and John, two of the leaders of the church, and they realized that they were unschooled, ordinary men, they were astonished, and they took note that these men had been with Jesus. The leaders of this early movement were unschooled and ordinary. And I just want to set your hearts and minds at ease. The leaders you have at Wellspring are as unschooled and as ordinary as any men or women you need. I mean, you'll never find more unschooled, ordinary folks than what we have right here. So we got that. You can check that off the list. That's all. It's all good. Sometimes you say, well, it requires lots of money. I mean, let's just be honest. Where's the bottom line? To create a movement, it takes a lot of money, all right? That's how things work. And so when you go to around cities around the country, where are the large metroplex, mall-looking churches in these cities? Where are they at? They're in the wealthy suburbs of these cities, right? That's where they are. That's where the money's at to build these humongous Six Flags Over Jesus buildings. That's where they are, right? So you'll see those in every city around the country. Nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying anything. That's just the reality. And so we assume, well, it takes a lot of money to do this, right? You just have to find a lot of wealthy people to pull this together. And we're not a lot of wealthy people, so we're in trouble, right? That's not true. You look later in the New Testament, and there was Paul, as he was going around to different churches in different cities, he was collecting offerings in those cities to bring back to Jerusalem so that they could meet their daily needs and necessities. They didn't have enough to eat. They didn't have enough to provide for their kids. So much so that other churches were seeing the poverty in this place, the abject poverty in Jerusalem, and they were collecting money so that when Paul would come around, he'd take it up and he would bring it back to Jerusalem to help feed their kids. They didn't have lots of money. A movement does not require thousands of people. A movement does not require a charismatic, brilliant leadership. A movement does not require extraordinary wealth. So what's required to get a movement of God in place? Well, let's look at Acts chapter 2 again. I think the first thing that's required, I think they had an unreasonable amount of connection one to each other. They were just irrational in the way they connected with each other and spent time together. Acts chapter 2, let's look at 42 again. Kind of the key verse. I want you to notice the number of times the word community or something about community is mentioned. Words like fellowship, breaking of bread, together, they, those kind of things. Look at this. 42. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, that's getting together in community building, to the breaking of bread, that's eating together in their homes, that's about community, and to prayer, much of which is for each other, that's community. Everyone, again, community, was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers, all of them, were together, had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone as he had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes. They ate together with glad and sincere hearts. Are you picking up the commonality of this? I mean, they were irrational. They were unreasonable in the way that they connected to each other. I mean, they were able to accomplish this movement of God in part because they were so connected to each other. They did it together. It wasn't a handful of people doing it. It wasn't some great pastor doing it. It was them all together. And if you want to boil down even a little further, that first part of the first 3 words of Acts 2:42 says they devoted themselves. I've read this 1,000 times, but it jumped out at me this week when I was looking at it. They devoted themselves. I want you to notice how different that is from something else he could have written. How much different is they devoted themselves to versus if he just said the apostles signed them up. They were going to create this movement, and so Peter and John signed them up to do it, right? It's very different. They devoted themselves to it. How much different is they devoted themselves? Peter made them feel guilty and obligated, so they went along with it. It's fine, we'll do it. It's very different. It's a community thing. How much different is they devoted themselves then? They tepidly put one toe in the water to see if it was okay or not. I mean, you don't see that. What you see is people giving of their time, giving of their energy, giving of their ability, giving of their money, putting it all out on the table for each other because they were in it together. They were creating a movement of God together. And because they had these unreasonable amounts of connection, God was able to do great things among them. Jesus tells a great story about a farmer who goes out and scatters seed, and this farmer represents all of us who hear the words of God. And it says some of the seed falls on bits of the path, and so because it was hard, the seed couldn't go in, and that represents people who don't understand the words of God and just never really gets in their life at all. And then some seed falls among the thorns, and so it grows up quickly, but it says roots or thorns choke it out, and weeds make it unfruitful. And it represents people whose lives are just so crowded with worry and concern and struggle with money and time and such. Because they're so worried with all that, they just can't allow the words of God to really do anything in their life, and they're choked out. And then some seed falls on the good soil, and that represents people who really are following God authentically, and they're doing great things for God. But then there's this fourth group. And it's always been fascinating to me. I know we've talked about it before, but it's always fascinating to me. And this is kind of the theme for this whole series is that this seed fell on this soil, and it was in a rocky area, and so it grew up quickly, and they were excited about the words of God, these people were, but because there's rocks and there wasn't much soil there, it lacked root, and when the sun came out or wind came out or opposition came out, it withered and died. And it represents a person who doesn't have much root in their life, and so when hard times come, even though they're excited about the words of God, they wither. And you see this in chapter 13, verse 20. It says, the seed falling on rocky ground refers to people who hear the word and at once receive it with joy. But since they have no root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. Now, I was always taught as a kid, this meant you need to have deep theological knowledge. You need to have all kinds of study. We need to dig into the Bible all the time so we could understand enough to have root and sustenance when times are tough. But I don't believe that. Because this movement was led by unschooled, ordinary men who didn't have all that training that we were told we needed. What I believe is the roots in this story represent, for this plant, represents connections to good soil, right? I mean, it's what roots do. And good soil in this analogy has a name. The good soil is people who are living their life out for God. And so the plant that didn't have root, I believe, was the person who heard about the words of God, but for whatever reason, they were isolated. They didn't have any community, no connectedness to anybody else. And so because it was just them and God, them and God, them and God, when hard times come or difficulties or questions or confusion, they're just all by themselves and they wither, they fall away. And the rootedness is the idea that we all need each other. We all need to be connected to one another. And if you don't have those connections in your life, you're not going to find your way to stick with God when times are difficult. You're just asking for problems to come. Now, one of the reasons we've chose this theme for this series is because this is a real problem, I think, in Spring Hill. People move here from all over the country, and they don't have family here, and they don't have friends here, and they live here in Spring Hill, but they work in Brentwood with people who live in Dixon, and they don't know anybody around there, and their neighbors, they assume, will be gone in 2 years, or they'll be gone in 2 years, so there's no need to invest in them, and so we drive into our garages and shut the door behind us and go into privacy fences and never meet anybody. And it's sort of an isolated place. It's such a transient community that it really has a hard time. So we want to create roots out into the community. both from us and help people to do that, facilitate that for them. But if I could be honest, that same hesitancy to really connect with other people doesn't stop here at the edges of this room. It comes in here too. And even though I think we do this in some ways really well, in other ways we have such a long ways to go. And there's so many of you who are just this little island, you and God, you and God, you and God, but if tough times come, you're a sitting duck to fall away, to wither, to be separated from God. One of the reasons the movement was so powerful is they had this unreasonable level of connection to one another they devoted themselves to. And it's something we want to see in our church as well. The second thing they had, which is really important, is they had an irrational amount of faith. I mean, they were crazy with the decisions they made and the risks they took and the opportunities they went after. I mean, they believed in God. They believed that Jesus was coming back. They believed that He really had died and He really was God and now He really is alive again. And the whole world hinges upon what people do with Jesus. I mean, they believed that. And they believed that God was going to be working in them and through them to reach this world for Jesus. And they were able to squelch the fear that must have been there. See, I think there's a real connection between faith and fear, and they sort of work in inverse proportions. And so when you have a lot of fear, it makes it hard to have a lot of faith. And when you have a lot of faith, it makes it hard to have a lot of fear. And they sort of work against each other. Just think for a minute about the Bible, maybe some of the stories you may know or you may not know. You know, we read one of the heroes of the Old Testament is a man named Moses, who was living out in the desert. He was a shepherd. He didn't have a lot of military training and things. And so God says, I want you to go to the most powerful man in the world, who has the most powerful army in the world, and I want you to tell him to let all his free labor go, and you're going to take him out by force if you're required. And the only weapon you're going to need is this stick. It should be enough. We read that and think, that's a great story. Can you imagine how scary that must have been? To go into the king's room and, hello, can I talk to you? Can you imagine how scary that must have been? And the fear and his faith balanced with each other, and his faith pushed him through in spite of his fear. We read a story later on about Gideon, who takes a small handful of men and attacks this large army with only clay pots and torches in their hands. Must that have been scary? Absolutely. But his faith overcame his fear, and so it worked. We read about David later on, where David was standing there and he comes up to bring lunch to his brothers at the battlefield. And here's this giant of a man, 9 foot tall, and all this armor and all this training. And he says, anybody want to fight me? And all these guys cower back. And David says, he can't talk about my God like that. And this young man, David, rushes out onto the battlefield with no plan, no armor, no just raw passion. He says, you're not going to talk about my God like that. And his faith overcame his fear. Even think about Jesus. We don't talk about this much. I don't know why we overlook this. But can you imagine how scary Jesus must have been, what he knew was coming must have been for him? Jesus knew how the Romans abused people. He had seen them torture other people. He had seen them crucify other people. It was a common thing, and they were good at it. And Jesus was praying that night, God, if this can pass from me, I'd love that. I'll do whatever you say. My faith's bigger than my fear. But don't you know he was scared? God, he was completely God, so he was above this, but he was also completely human. So he felt that pain. He felt that fear. He must have felt that anxiety. But his faith overcame his fear. And if you look in the book of Acts, not just in this second chapter, but all the way through, there's story after story of opposition and oppression and resistance and fear. And yet time and again, they took their fear and they placed it submissively underneath their faith, and they said, our faith in God is going to allow us to do this, even though everything inside of us is freaking out, because we feel like God's telling us to do whatever it is. And there are times when we need to follow God in faith in spite of our fear. Now, let me be very clear. A lot of pastors use these kind of talks to manipulate people into being stupid and to go along with stupid ideas. I'm not saying ignorance and faith are not synonymous. Let's be very clear on that, okay? The Bible says love the Lord with all your heart, but it also says love Him with all your mind. And there's a balance in all of that. But there are times when the scales just don't balance. There are times when the things just don't add up. And yet you feel clear that God is telling you to do something, and your faith has to overcome your fear. It just has to. I mean, the very nature of being a Christian is that you at one point stood before God and said, I can't be good enough, I can't be smart enough, I can't be spiritual enough or together enough, so God, you're just going to have to save me. And your faith overcame your fear, and you gave yourself to Christ. It's the very nature of what it means to be a Christian. The Christian life is designed to be an adventure that requires irrational amounts of faith. Francis Chan compares it like a gymnast on a balance beam. You know, gymnasts do on the balance beam, right? They get up there and they stand before the judge and they do their thing, and then they do this routine, and they're flipping over and they're jumping around and all this kind of stuff. And when they get done, they do the little thing to the judge, you know, they kind of bend their back like that, and then the judge shows 9.7 or 8.2 or whatever, and it's all exciting. And Francis Chan says the Christian life is a little bit like that. And I'm going to try something this morning. It's never good to have an idea from Francis Chan that's a little bit scary when you're teaching about fear, because then you have no excuse not to try it. So I'm going to try something, and this is either going to work out really, really well, or it's going to be a complete disaster. And we're going to find out at the same time. That's what's great about this. We're going to find out if this works or not. Francis Chan says that it's like this balance beam. And so you get up on this balance beam, and you're in your life, and you're going to do these great things for God, and you're excited about it, and you're idealistic, and you're going to take on the world. I remember when I was a kid, I was going to be an NBA star, even though no one in my family is over 6'3", and none of us have athletic ability. But other than that, it was going to happen. And I was also, when I gave myself to Christ, I was going to change the world by September. I had that all mapped out. I was going to lead my whole town to Jesus, and I was going to change all these things. But then life happens. And you get disappointed, and you get hurt, and you get broke up with, and you lose your job, and money's tight, and your career doesn't go. All these things that happen. And you begin to get a little more fearful, and a little more scared, and a little less adventuresome as you get older. We call it wisdom, but it's really just fear, let's be honest. And so what happens is, instead of doing this balance beam thing, what you start doing is you just kind of go, I'm just gonna lay down and be real safe right here like this. And you cling to life, and you say, I'm gonna live in a gated community, and I'm gonna make my kids wear a helmet everywhere they go, and I'm going to homeschool my kids, and I'm going to let my kids not sit in the sun because rays are bad, and they're not going to ride their bikes, or they're not going to date anybody, and I'm going to be safe, and this is going to be good. This is going to be great. And then you just live this way safely with God, and you say, God, okay, I want to go to church, but I don't want to do any of the crazy stuff the Bible talks about, because that's scary, and so I'll volunteer in the nursery, because that's kind of guilty if I don't, but I'm not going to do anything crazy, and I'll give a few dollars if I have any in my wallet, but I'm not going to tithe, because that's sort of crazy. And I'm going to not do anything really spooky or freaky that my friends will think are weird. But I'm going to go to church, and I'm going to do that, and this is just going to be great. Me and you, God, me and you. This will be fantastic, right? And then you start, as you get on your life, you say, God, help me maybe just to die in my sleep so I don't have to feel it, because that would be scary. And help me not to make a fool of myself in front of the whole church, because that'd be sort of embarrassing. And God, help me to just, at the end of my life, God, if you could just help me just ease out, and I will ease out of this life, and I'll ease into the next, and I won't even feel it, and it'll be awesome. And so one night as you're praying that, and you're having a dream about dying in your sleep, you sort of slip out of this life, and you slip in real easily to the next, and you wake up and you open your eyes, and you're standing before the King of Kings. And you go, all right, I did this thing, the whole routine is great. And Francis Chan says, what do you expect God to do? God, who the Bible describes as a judge, when he sees that routine, what do you expect him to do? Now, I understand, let me be clear, we're saved not because of anything good we do, all of that stuff. But the Bible talks about this. It never uses the word balance beam, but it talks about this. It talks about what it means when somebody lives their life so afraid and so tentative and so fearful, and then stands before God. The Bible actually tells us what happens. Jesus tells a story about 3 men, and they were all Christians, and they were following God, and one guy was given a lot of ability, opportunities, and he lived his life full out for God. He took risks, and he made efforts, and he did things crazy, and he put himself all the way out there. I mean, to use the sports analogy, he left it between the lines. Whatever you want to use. I mean, he was out there for God, and he got to the end of his life, and he stood before God, and God said, well done. That's exactly right. And there's another guy, and he didn't have as much talent, as much opportunity, but he was pretty talented, and again, left it all out there for God. Took risks, took chances. I mean, he went out on the limb sometimes when it didn't make sense, but he felt like God was telling him to do it, and he was all the way out there, and one day he stands before God, and God says, well done, well done. But there was a third guy, and he was given a little bit of talent, a little bit of opportunity, and he was scared. And so he hung on to his balance beam, and he hung on real tight, and he stayed real safe. And he stood before God one day, no scrapes on his knees, elbows were nice and shiny, no scars anywhere, no tattoos or anything crazy. I mean, he was just, very, very together, very good. And he stood before God, having really done nothing with it, but never making a mistake. I mean, never falling off and looking silly, never doing anything obtrusively. And Matthew 25, verse 29 says, to those who use well what they are given, even more will be given, and they have an abundance. But from those who do nothing, even what little they have will be taken away. And the Message translation is a little more harsh. It says, take the 1,000, that represents his talents. Take the 1,000 and give it to the one who risked the most. And get rid of this play it safe who won't go out on a limb. I mean, the Bible tells us what this is going to look like. If we go through our life so timid, so scared, so safe, I mean, we don't make any mistakes, but we take no risks for God. It's really not that we don't have faith in ourselves, it's that we don't have faith in Him. And faith is the antidote to that fear. The faith that says, I don't believe that I can pull this off, but God, if you want me to do it, I know you'll make it work somehow. I can't make the ledgers balance out, but God, you're going to be enough to make this work. One of my favorite stories is of Elisha and his servant, and a large army came to get him and to captivate him, and his servant wakes out, and I picture him with a cup of coffee. He walks out kind of sleepy-eyed, looks out of the tent, and there's this huge army waiting to get him. And he goes back in, he's like, Elisha, you need to come out here, dude. I don't know what's going on out here. And Elisha comes out real calm and collected and says, don't worry about it. And in 2 Kings 6, verse 16, he says, don't be afraid. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them. To which case the servant is like, okay, there's just two of us, and there's a lot of them. You're not awake yet. You're not. And then he prays, and God opens his eyes, and he looks, and the whole hillside is full of God's warriors ready to help them. And long story short, humanly speaking, Elisha and his servant, just two guys, capture this whole army and take them before their enemies. There's more with us than there's those with them. And no matter what the right answer is, living life fearfully, living life afraid to take risks for God is never the right answer. Faith is the antidote to that fear. And not so ironically, I think having relational connections also helps with the fear. Isn't it true? If you were in downtown Nashville at 2 a.m. in a dark alley with no lights out, and you're by yourself and you hear a little bit of a sound behind you, doesn't it freak you completely out? But if there's somebody else with you, even though, let's be honest, if there's a whole gang of people trying to take you out, one other person's, if Amy and I are there together, we're still in deep water. If the two of us there against the whole group, but there's something about having a second person there or a third that all of a sudden gives you a lot of confidence. It's a lot of ability. There's something about human connection that helps us to go through scary things in ways that very little else can. My 2 5-year-olds, I told First Hour, my 2 5-year-olds will do some of the craziest shenanigans that my older girls would have never been brave enough to try because there's two of them doing it together. Not always a good thing with 5-year-olds and shenanigans. But if we could apply that same idea to faith, we could create a movement that would change this place. It would change the world. It's roots. It's the idea of putting down roots into our community and for our community. I remember I was thinking this week, almost 9 years ago, this month anyway, Amy and I and our 4-year-old at the time daughter and our 2-year-old at the time daughter, and we had no twins. Didn't know twins didn't exist at that time. We moved to Spring Hill to start this church. Didn't have a clue. I was 30 years old. Didn't have a clue what I was doing. And I thought I did, but I didn't have a clue what I was doing. And our church was 2 people, and I remember going to the bank, 4, I guess you count Laura and Emily, but they didn't give any money, so it didn't help. Anyway, so if you count the 2 of us, we went to the bank and we said we wanted to buy a house, and that's when financing was a little easier than it is now. And they said, okay, so do you have a big down payment? I was like, no, we're trying to sell a house in Indiana. We have no down payment at all. And they said, well, what do you do? And I said, I'm a pastor. And they said, well, what church are you with? I said, well, we've not named it yet. And they said, well, where do you meet at? We've not had a first meeting yet. We don't know where we're going to meet at. Well, how many people are in your church? I said, it says, They said, so you want to borrow $145,000? I said, that's pretty much what I'm looking for. Yeah, that's right. And for whatever reason, he said yes to that. And he signed off, and we bought this house, right? And it's one of those things where all the way through, some of the scariest moments we've had as a church, and there's been a number of them, I could tell you more, but there's some of the scariest moments we've had as a church. I look back at those, and those are some of the best growth moments we ever had in me and through the church and in other people. Because when we're self-sufficient and it's not scary and it's all together, I don't want to say this, but God's not necessary, really. You know what I'm saying? He's not. But when it's all the way on the edge of the limb and it's scary and we're not sure how it's going to work and we don't know how it's all going to happen and God's going to have to make it work, God is able to show up. And that's why Paul says, in my weakness, God is strong, because when I'm on the edge of what I can do, God comes through and is enough. He's enough. One of the real goals we had then was to not be an established church. We heard about churches saying they were a new church, but now they were established, and they were so proud. And I thought, I don't want to be established. Because established means we don't need God anymore. We've got a nice building and a nice budget and a nice group and a nice leadership. We don't need God anymore. And I don't want us to be that way. I never wanted us to be that way. Putting down roots is not the same as being established. Putting down roots is not the same as saying, okay, finally we can relax. No, roots are designed to help the plant thrive. 2 Kings chapter 19 says, once more a remnant of the house of Judah will take root below and bear fruit above. The point of roots is that God does work in us, connecting us through us to Him, that allows us to do great things outside of Him, outside of us. That's what this movement is about. I was reminded of those early days this week, and then in first hour, I was sitting right over there during worship, and I looked over and I saw the McClellans sitting over here, and I don't know if you know them, but they were with us from day one, and we were trying to build a launch team. We got past the 4 of us, and we were trying to get a little more, and so we had 49 people, and I've told this story, but it's one of my favorites. So we had 49 people in our launch team. We were keeping track of every head, trying to get this thing built up, and one day it dawned on me, as I was trying to get to 50, we couldn't get to 50. One day it dawned on me that Jennifer's pregnant, and I believe that's a life in there, so that's 50, So Creed McClellan became number 50, the 50th person in our church, and he's now 8. And it's like they're actually going to do a thing with him, like a time-lapse thing of Creed, is like as he grew up, this is the same age as our church. And I was thinking about all that, again, sitting right over here, and I was sitting beside Rhodes Morgan. Amy was holding Rhodes. Any little boy, Amy grabs and steals. So she was sitting there, and I was sitting by Rhodes Morgan, and I thought, what's 8 years from now going to look like? And we're going to talk about how Rhodes was part of this, from when he was a little bitty guy to now he's, And I look around this church, and I see so many little bodies that are growing up, and what's it going to be like? What's Wellspring going to be for them 5 years from now, 10 years from now? I don't know. I don't have a clue. But I think it's going to be so much bigger than a building. It's going to be so much bigger than a campaign or a series. This is a movement we're trying to do. And I really believe that God is going to use it to change this city. I really believe that. And I want us to be part of that together.